Since I have a background in concept art, I usually have a fairly clear picture in mind of what I want the final render to look like. I'll usually start the modelling process with at least a simple sketch to work from, and I usually block out some basic geometry right at the start, set up the camera so I know exactly what the scene's going to look like. For this render, however, I went in completely blind. I had no idea what the final composition was going to look like. I just started modelling. I knew that some assets were definitely going to be in the final render. Since this was like a 1950s diner, there obviously was going to be like counter stools, menus, bottles of ketchup, stuff like that. So I started modelling them. Once the stool was complete, I applied the subsurf modifier, cleaned up some of the topology. It isn't always necessary to do cleanups like this, but my PC is a little bit of an old girl, and she needs all the help she can get. By removing unneeded verts, it gives me a little bit of a boost to render times, and the general viewport performance gets better. I just select any edge loops that don't directly contribute to the shape of the mesh and then dissolve them. I managed to reduce the number of verts by about 5,000 per stool, and it didn't alter the shape of the mesh at all. The menus are actually just single-sided planes with a different texture applied to each side. I already have a video on how to apply two different textures to one plane. I'll link that down in the description, you can check that out afterwards. I also left a little bit of a clear border around the images when I exported from Photoshop. That meant that I could make the images look like they were kind of laminated and had a little bit of plastic going around the outside. The ketchup bottles themselves were pretty straightforward, so I won't bore you with how I made those. But the texturing was quite interesting. I noticed on some reference photos that you can sort of see through a lot of ketchup bottles and you can see where the level of the ketchup is. I used a gradient texture and a colour ramp to define the level of the ketchup. Then I used the output of that to control a mix shader. I mixed in a principal shader and a translucent shader, so the top of the bottle would look more translucent than the bottom. At this point, I decided there was no point continuing with the scene until I'd set up some sort of basic composition. I tried a few ideas and then decided that a shot looking down the counter would probably be the best composition. You can see here that I'm actually measuring out the height of the camera. For interior renders like this, I try to keep the camera at a height that an actual camera would be held at, somewhere between 1.3 to 2 meters. It's a small thing, but it really helps with overall realism in the final render. I also set the camera in this case to be about 35mm focal length. That's a fairly typical focal length for real-world photography in like indoor architecture scenes. I duplicated the assets I made a few times and just distributed them around the counter. I made sure to press Shift-Z whenever I moved them, so they would only move in the X and Y direction. Distributing objects like this can be a little bit tricky. It sort of comes down to some artistic instinct. You don't want to create something that looks too placed and too perfect, but you do want to try and get the best composition you can, so it's a bit of a balancing act. I decided that this piece needed some sort of focal point or point of interest, so I started working on a neon sign. The sign itself was just half a sphere that I flattened out a little bit, but the neon tubes that I created by using a curve, a Bezier curve, and I added a little bit of depth through it. I extruded the verts off the curve and then just rotated it until it was moved into shape. It looks nice and easy on this time lapse, but it was a total pain in the arse to get right. Real neon lights don't look like Blender's emission objects. They're bright and almost perfectly white in the middle, but the outer part of the light is more saturated and darker. I achieved that look just by using the face and output of a layer weight node, and I plugged that in to control the brightness of the emission shader. I also decided to stick a little green point light just behind the sign, which would make it pop even more by lighting up the wall behind it. At this point I decided that the scene probably needed a proper focal point, so I started working on a jukebox. I wasn't too concerned about matching the exact model of a specific real-world jukebox, but I just used a few reference images so I could get the basic shape down. I have a custom library of images like this that I've painted. I use them to add random variation to surfaces, scratches, smudges, things like that. This one I used to define the smudges that would be all over the glass of the jukebox, like it's had loads of grubby little fingers touching all over it. I had to try a few different random light setups until I found one for the final render that looked very clean. I didn't go with this one in the end, I don't think. I thought the legs of the jukebox would be nice and straightforward, but they ended up being the trickiest challenge of the whole render. The first thing I tried was just to use some texture painting. I used the texture that I'd painted to drive the colour of an emission shader. I tried mixing in a principal shader into that so it would sort of look like light was passing through diffused plastic, and it looked like total crap. I tried a few different things through the course of the render. We'll cover those later on, but this was a hard one to get right. I used a bit of beveling and an array modifier to make some tiles. This was another mistake that I ended up taking out the render later on. The lamps though, they were lovely and easy. The actual recording of this section without being sped up at all is like 1.5 minutes long. For the material on the lamps, I wanted to match this handmade look I'd seen on a reference photo. It had all these lovely ridges around the side of like a ceramic lamp. I didn't know if that's where it had been like handmade or hand painted, but it looked really cool. So I used a noise node and I mixed that in with a Musgrave node. Then I altered the scale of the Musgrave node that gave me these nice grooves around the side. I expected it to be one of those details that wouldn't actually show up in the final render, but you can see them in the end and it did look pretty good. I was fairly happy with it considering these lamps took like 5 minutes maybe to make. At this point I was playing around with the lighting and I did a quick test render. I thought it looked pretty terrible and to be honest I considered quitting the entire project. I had one last test just to see if this would look good. I added a strong sun lamp outside that would sort of strewn some harsh light across the floor. I actually thought that looked alright, so I continued on at least for now. I've skipped most of this part of the process to save you from my torture, but I came back to the legs on the jukebox and had another go at improving. This time I scaled down the object that was emitting the light so it would be inside the legs, and then I turned on a little bit of transmission on the plastic material on the outside to act as like a plastic diffuser. It still looked a bit naff, but it was better than the first version at least. I wanted more control to all these lights I was adding to the scene, so I converted the lamps to be IES lights. I've got a link about IES lights, I'll link to those below, but basically the light profiles and they change the shape of the fall off of the light source. You can see here I'm just trying a few different IES profiles from this big library I've got. I also added a black body node to control the light colour. A black body node basically allows you to set the actual colour temperature of a light source, so it's kind of like a real light bulb. Low values like 1000 make a really red light, which made this whole thing look like a CD bar. High values like 5 to 10,000 are like a white to blue light, kind of like a fluorescent bulb. Most light bulbs are in the 3 to 6,000 range. Since I had some pretty strong lights going on, I thought the scene would benefit from some detail on the floor. The texture map set that I downloaded did have a height map, but I didn't want to add loads of polys to the scene. I got rid of all the parts of the floor that wouldn't appear on camera. Then I just added some quick loop cuts and aligned them to be in line with where the tiles are. I selected all the cuts, beveled them, and then I extruded down a little bit to make just a small groove in between the tiles. This method uses loads less polys than a displacement map would, and I think the results are just as good, probably 90% of the time. I noticed from all the reference photos I'd collected that diners tend to have a lot of crap on the walls, so I made about a dozen photo frames, which turned out to be nowhere near enough, and I just moved them into place. I used the same method I did with the counter. Once I had one lined up, I locked out one axis and then just slid them around to the wall in place. I did another test render of this side of the image, and this is when I realised that I hated the tiles. I deleted those and started working on some wood trimmings that would go around the wall. You shouldn't hesitate to take something out of a render if you know it doesn't look right, regardless of how much work you put into it. It's better to waste an hour modelling an asset you don't use than keeping it in the scene and it ruins the final render. As I've talked about already in previous videos, I like to reuse textures whenever possible. It saves me time not having to keep making textures, and it uses less resources because the computer doesn't have to load in as many images when it comes to the final render. I used Substance Painter for the jukebox, so I just reused the wood texture I made for the blackboard that was going to go on the wall. I used a hue node just to tweak some of the colours and the values so that the wood wouldn't look the same on both. I created some really simple geometry just to act as a plate, and then I used an array modifier to turn it into a stack. I was originally going to add loads more detail to the plates, but I'm glad that I didn't because they came out looking fine in the end. At this point I noticed that the chrome on the stools was looking a little bit dim, probably not helped by the fact I was still using a nighttime HDRI for some reason. I added a picture of a diner into the scene, and I made that plain an emission object. It doesn't really matter about matching the 3D scene that much, as long as it basically looks like a diner it'll be fine. Here's the render without that image added, and here it is after. You can see that it doesn't add any details specifically to the reflections, but it does kind of give you the impression that the room stretches back further than it does. At this point I just had to model a few more assets to go on the back counter. To make a wire mesh drink tray, I added a plane, gave it some loop cuts in each direction, then I selected around the whole thing and extruded up slightly. I gave it a couple of more cuts, and then I added the wireframe modifier. I slapped a basic glossy material under it and I called it a day. It took me about 7 attempts to render this before I finally got one I was happy with. Halfway through the process I would notice a problem every time. I used 1,000 samples to get this render, and it looked alright, especially after I denoised it, which looked like this. However, I still noticed a problem with it. Because I turned off Cortex, you can see that the salt shakers on the front counter look black, and also the glasses on the back counter look pretty dark. So I just spot rendered out those little parts with the better settings, and then I composited those over the top in Photoshop. This is the final version after a little bit of tweaking, some colour correcting, stuff like that. I also added a little bit of noise back into the image. I don't like the way that denoising software makes everything look too clean, so I just added a little bit of noise back in, and overall I was fairly happy with the render. The project files for this render, like always, will be available on my Patreon account. You'll find links to that and everything else I've mentioned in the description bar. You'll also find the like and subscribe button down there, so hit those while you're on. I hope you enjoyed this video guys, and I'll see you in a couple of days time for the next one.